Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing life in ancient China. So let's talk about the social classes that were in ancient Chinese society. So the Chinese society was made up of different social classes, and a social class, if you'll remember, is a group of people in a society with the same economic and social position. So in Chinese society, there were four different social classes. The first one that we have were the aristocrats, and then we have the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. So let's take a look at the aristocrats. A very small number of people were considered aristocrats in Chinese society. They were very wealthy and they owned very large plots of land and lived on large estates. So if you went to the house of an aristocrat, they would have had a very large home with tile roofs and courtyards and gardens. Inside, they would have had very fine furniture and silk hangings filling their rooms, and their houses were surrounded by walls to keep out bandits. Aristocratic families did not own large estates for long. Because each aristocrat divided his land amongst his sons, as a result, the sons and the grandsons ended up owning much less property than their fathers and grandfathers had owned. So the aristocrats relied on the next social class of people, to the farmers, to grow the crops that made them rich. About 9 out of 10 Chinese were farmers. They lived in simple houses inside village walls, and the aristocrats owned the fields outside the village walls. So, in these fields, the farmers in northern China would grow wheat and a grain called millet, and in the south, where the climate was warmer and wetter, more similar to North Carolina, Florida, South Carolina, they were able to grow rice. So, in order for the farmers to have use of the land, they had to pay rent in the form of crops, and they would pay this rent to the aristocrats. Most farmers also owned a small piece of land where they would grow food for their family, and a typical family would eat fish, turnips, beans, wheat or rice, and millet. The farmers had to pay taxes and work 1 month each year building roads and helping on other big government projects. In wartime, the farmers also served as soldiers. In Chinese society, farmers ranked above merchants and artisans. So, just like in the other civilizations and cultures that we've talked about, Chinese society had artisans, and the artisans were the skilled workers who made useful objects such as tools and silk cloth and other items that the society needed. Most of the artisans followed in the footsteps of their fathers. So they learned their skills from their fathers and they taught them to their sons, and this is how the tradition and their skills were passed on from generation to generation. So let's continue on to the last social class, the merchants. Like I mentioned before, in Chinese society, farmers ranked above the merchants, and the merchant class included shopkeepers, traders, and bankers. And merchants typically lived in the towns and provided goods and services to the aristocrats and the landowners. Now, many of these merchants became quite rich, but landowners and farmers still looked down on them. Chinese leaders believed that government officials should not be concerned with money, and as a result, merchants were not allowed to have government jobs themselves. So, how did all of this affect Chinese family life? The family was the building block of Chinese society, and because farming in ancient China required many workers, people had big families to help them produce more food and become wealthier. Even the young children of a family worked in the fields. Older sons raised their crops and provided food for their parents, and Chinese families also took care of people in need, the old aged people, the young, the sick. They also, if you'll remember, practiced filial piety. So, this meant that children had to respect their parents and their older relatives. Family members placed the needs and desires of the head of the family before their own. And the head of the family in Chinese society was usually the oldest male, the father in the family. However, a son could take on this role, and then even his mother had to obey him. So, in Chinese society, men and women had very different roles in early China. Men were respected because they grew crops, they went to school, they ran the government, and they even fought in wars. And the Chinese considered these jobs more important than the work that women did. Even though Chinese women could not hold government posts, if they were members in the royal court, they could influence government decisions. So the wives of rulers or women in the royal family often convinced men in power to see things their way. And although their role was limited, women also had an important influence in the home. Most women raised children and saw to their education, and women also managed the family finances.